For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard and Mike here with something we're incredibly grateful for. We're going to visit today with the team from Lazard. Lazard has a geopolitical advisory effort that's part of their overall investment banking business. It's something we've talked about in the past. It's quite interesting. It's reflective of today's world. Teddy Bunzel is here with us. Teddy runs or leads that group. And so we're obviously going to be talking about all the stresses in the world, i.e. what's happening in Iran and in the Mideast. We're super excited to have Admiral Bill McRaven join us as well. He's a senior advisor at Lazard. He's the former Four-Star Admiral that we've been lucky enough to have on the show, but he's obviously an American hero, and we're delighted to have you, Admiral. And also George Bilicic is with us. George is vice chairman and global head of power, energy, and infrastructure. He's also our good friend, and when we do things with Lazard, it's courtesy of George. So George, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for making this happen, and we're really excited to talk about everything that's going on.
It's great for all of us to be here. Thank you.
Well, Mike, we could just do an entire show with you doing the market update, and then we'd have to redo it in another hour. But give us some of the highlights as you see them in the markets right now.
Yeah, well, obviously, this week has been all about Iran, obviously. I mean, it's really interesting to me is when you look at the volatility, just not only each day, but just intraday, it's just phenomenal. Not only for the markets, but just commodities as well. And so, but there's a lot of interesting things that are going on that just, you wouldn't expect would be happening. For example, a 10-year bond yield's like at 4.06%. It's up maybe 10 basis points. So there's a little bit of basically rush to treasuries, but safe havens like gold and silver are actually down since this has happened. So that's a bit surprising to me. But maybe a lot of that is basically dollar denominated stuff of that nature. But it just surprised me a little bit. WTI is at roughly $73 today. That's up $4 on day one. Today is day two, essentially from a trading standpoint. It got up as high as $6 or $7. And the reason it got up $6 or $7 early this morning and has since pulled back is because people are talking about the Strait of Hormuz effectively being shut down at this point in time. We're talking around 15 to 20 million barrels per day as effectively not moving out of the straits. And so the issue with that is not only is stuff not getting out, but storage is basically piling up. And so there's no more room. And so you're seeing Iraq is basically looking to shut down some of their fields right now. And so two things need to happen. A, you need to get oil out of the Gulf. Right? And number two, you probably need to get tankers in the Gulf for storage. So there's, something on both sides going on. So it's really, really interesting. And, later and, just a little while ago, Trump came out and basically said what he should have been saying is that, look, we're going to provide financial security, meaning insurance for these tankers, which we need so they can start to move. And he also talked about, basically, providing military escorts, which, that seemed like a pretty easy, pretty solution right there. So, I compare that to what people were saying yesterday is we need to have like this global SPR drawdown here. And effectively, the Trump administration hasn't said that just yet. That's not the issue they're using. I think the issue they're going about right now is going to be much more effective. And this compares to sort of Biden. When Biden was president, he took 240 million barrels out of the SPR. That was 40% he took out of the SPR. For the Ukrainian, crisis, I guess, if you will. And some said that he was just using it to manipulate markets anyways. But there is a big difference on how they're approaching this, and I think they're doing it the right way. The other thing is everyone kind of concentrates on oil prices, but if you look at gasoline prices, diesel prices, heating oil, they're up around 20%. There's going to be an effect, but that's probably going to be a short-term effect. We'll see how quickly they come down. Qatari LNG, first time it's been shut down in 30+ years. And so you had EU gas, and plus you have EU gas storage that is extremely low at this point in time. So you have both those setups. And so that spiked the, EU natural gas prices on a US dollar, US equivalent, it went from around $11 per M to $20 per M. US gas prices has not really moved this week on this. They're down at $3 an M. So clearly, the LNG market has probably been one of the bigger beneficiaries. Everyone's been focused on the oil side. You got to focus on the LNG side as well. The other thing too is Rotterdam coal prices. They're up 15 to 20% too. So it's just not an oil and gas situation. It's a commodity situation. So that's very interesting. As far as energy performance, you've had, energy sectors up around 2%. LNG providers have really moved. They're up 8 to 9%. Refiners are up 6 to 8%, which you probably wouldn't have expected. You would have expected oil to move. Refiners would underperform. They're not. E&Ps are up 4 or 5%, and oil services are kind of lagging here. It goes back to what we've said before. This military strike is going to be great short term for, commodities. They're going to be, okay for the energy equities, but they're going to underperform on the way up because people are not going to be buying into that. They're going to be selling into that. Long only funds are not going to be buying into this effort. They're going to sell into this effort. They're going to step to the sidelines. So, once things calm down, once oil prices go down, gas prices go down, you're probably going to see energy is probably going to go down as much or maybe more, and so you probably be buying into that. So that's a bit. And the last thing we'd say is just the overall markets, the S&P Dow, they're only down about 1%. That's pretty remarkable from what's happened here. So that is really kind of a wrap up here. We'll see where things go, but I mean things are moving very fast paced, and like you said, Maynard, I mean 6 hours from now we might reshoot this again because things would be totally different. But that's kind of the state of the market.
Awesome. Well, look, thanks, Mike. There's a lot in there, Teddy and Bill and George, for all of us to keep up with. Maybe the right place to start is just kind of the situation on the ground, and so, or in the air, if you will. Admiral McRaven, in your experience, as you look at this as a military operation, we're 4 days in. What is your assessment of how it's going? Any reactions that you find surprising? Like, how do you just judge it as a military operation so far?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think it's unfolding about as we expected. So, if you go back a week or so, or even a month, as Trump began to build up the forces in the Middle East, and there was an expectation that we might strike Iran, I think there was kind of two courses of action. One was going to be a little bit more of a surgical strike, take out the IRGC, take out the police, take out, obviously the missile launchers and everything we could, but maybe stay away from the supreme leader and some of the very senior members, and really, not do a kind of full-on campaign. So there were two, a more surgical strike or a massive strike, and clearly they have decided to go big. There was no doubt in anybody's mind, in the military at least, that the Iranians would react differently this time around than they did during the 12-day war. One of our colleagues, General Eric Kurilla, who was the former commander of CENTCOM, led Midnight Hammer during the 12-day war. And the fact of the matter is, their expectation at the time was, look, the Iranians then, they waited almost 24 hours before they responded after the strikes on the nuclear facilities. At this time, there was every expectation that they would immediately launch the missiles and the drones, which they did. There is a little bit of surprise that they have gone after some of the civilian targets, some of the hotels in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and other places. But the sense is, hey, they're looking to, again, expand this war, drag it out, force Trump to be in a very, very difficult situation of, are there going to be more U.S. casualties? Probably. Are more people going to get involved in the war? Probably. And all of this makes it much more complicated, I think, from the Iranian standpoint, as they think about what is going to cause Trump maybe to come to the negotiating table, maybe to stop the bombing, is how complicated can they make it? How much can they drag it out? And clearly, I mean, this is kind of their strategy. Nothing we didn't anticipate, but it is a kind of, again, it's unfolding about like people expected.
So you just said something there that was just tactically, if you wouldn't mind, if you're the Iranians, is the go-to move to try to strike something big soon while you still have capabilities and in an effort to really disrupt this? Or is the better tactic, as you say, to just hunker down and survive as long as possible and quote win by just dragging it out?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a two-pronged approach. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Iranians would love to hit a major target, an aircraft carrier or a military base where there are a lot of U.S. troops. They want to create the most amount of casualties they can so that, once again, it ratchets up the pressure on President Trump. But they'll keep trying. Make no mistake about it. They will keep trying to do that. But in the meantime, it's a little bit of a death by a thousand cuts. Every place they can hit with a Shahed drone, every place they can hit with a ballistic missile, everything they can do to cause more chaos and to kind of inflame the Middle East creates pressure on the administration and our allies.
And if you don't mind, the military, the tactics when you have declared basically you are going to take out a government, so
Right.
maybe they don't have the scenario where they survive, so they know they're not going to survive ish. What does that do to your tactics? Because that means, as you said, you've got an opponent now who has an incentive to do really destructive things.
Yeah, I think the sense of things, from the Iranians is they may or may not have expected the supreme leader to be taken out, but they certainly knew that a lot of the military leadership was going to be taken out. So they frankly decentralized their command and control. So you push it down to the lowest possible level. You give people kind of command orders and say, look, here's your objectives. You execute at the level that we've given you authority to do that. But instead of having the captains that have to talk to the majors, who have to talk to the colonels, who have to talk to the generals, they have decentralized the military command. And therefore, in some ways, this is a little problematic because you don't know really who's leading the military in terms of a strategic sense. The good news is, for the Iranians at least, tactically, it's much more difficult for us to kind of target the drones because they're hidden in bunkers and they're hidden in caves and they're very mobile. So they come out, they launch, and they go back in. And our ability to kind of target that is a little problematic. And they still have thousands of drones left, and a lot of ballistic missiles.
If they don't have leadership, if the leaders have been taken out, does that mean it is hard for them to surrender? Like it would be hard to say, everybody lay down their weapons?
Well, of course, they have a council. They have a structure in place. I didn't mean to imply that, but again, they have taken out all the senior military leaders. They've taken out a lot of the political leadership, and so clearly there is somebody that has stepped up and said, I'm in charge, and the council is trying to provide some strategic guidance. It just makes it very difficult when you have kind of a fractured military command and control. I'm sure there is somebody there that could raise their hand and say, I'm speaking for the government of Iran, and we surrender. But I wouldn't expect that anytime soon, to be honest with you.
Maybe one more just military question, which is the tactic of decapitation or going after leadership. This seems, I know it's not new. You're a student of all of military history, but it does seem to be something we've embraced with more gusto than we had in previous operations. What do you think about it as a tactic, and is that a right read of how we're thinking now? Our thinking has changed?
Well, I mean, clearly there was a decision early on to take out the supreme leader. I will have to see whether or not that was a good decision. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we don't do this as a matter of course. Even in some of the most difficult conflicts, we have left the leaders of the countries alone and gone, whether they were political or military leaders, and gone after, again, the valid military targets, the military leadership, but we've kind of kept the political leaders, if you will, out of the sight picture. But clearly the administration went into this with the expectation that this was going to be regime change. Now, I've seen Secretary Hegseth said it was, well, it's not exactly regime change. Well, when you take out the supreme leader and all the senior leadership, there's got to be an expectation that there's going to be a regime change. But you have to be really, really careful. I mean, this apparatus that is this theocracy, that is the IRGC Quds Force, that is the secret police, this goes deep into the population of Iran. So, I mean, there is hope that, of course, the people will rise up and bring a Jeffersonian democracy to Iran. I do not see that happening. I think the best we can hope for is maybe a moderate theocracy at the end of this. But who knows? And again, the problem is you can't really divine where this is going to go. So the idea that we take out the supreme leader and some of the other senior leaders and Ahmadinejad and all the rest of these characters, and that somehow we're going to replace them with the Shah's son, and that everything's going to be on a real smooth path. I think recent history shows that hope is not a strategy, and that's not a strategy I think that will serve the administration well. But that, I think, is the strategy they're on right now. So let's hope it works. But, again, it's going to be difficult.
On this last point, it does seem like whether it's, I guess it seems more like the Israelis, but there's a lot of internal intelligence to Iran. It showed up in the 12-day war. It's showing up again now. Do you think that as we think about what might happen in the days to come, weeks to come, that there maybe has been some more connectivity with people internal to the country who may have, more of a plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the way it always works. This is the way it worked in Iraq. This is the way it worked in Afghanistan. You bet. I mean, the Mossad or the CIA have people on the ground that are trying to make connections to the people they think will be the next leaders. And I don't know that for a fact, but that's the general approach that we normally take. So there will be, again, sources on the ground that are talking to the people they think can mobilize and maybe, be the next leaders. But once again, that sounds good in the playbook. It's just hard to execute sometimes. And we are all hopeful that this will occur. I mean, the U.S. military and the administration is betting a lot on this. Clearly, a different Iran, an Iran that is not led by this horrible theocracy that's been out there, would be better for everybody in the Middle East. So, this is, again, we'll see where this goes, but a change of government in Iran that leans much more towards, the Western allies and towards Israel and to the GCC would be certainly a positive move. But one last thing I'd like to comment on here is just the nature of the U.S. military. And I had a chance to talk to some folks the other day and explain to them, look, even when we do large scale exercises, it is very challenging not to have a lot of casualties. I mean, the military, when you're launching and recovering airplanes off an aircraft carrier at night, when the sailors go days with only getting a little bit of sleep, when, you have a lot of moving parts out there, it becomes very, very challenging. And so the fact that we have really, unfortunately, we lost six great soldiers in an attack, and we had 3 planes shot down by friendly fire. But Trump has warned us, and I think rightfully so, that there could be more casualties coming. And the American people and the GCC and our allies have got to kind of steel ourselves for that as we go through this, because there will be casualties sometimes just in all the moving parts that are going on, and then the potential for, again, the Iranians to hit a target where there are U.S. casualties still remains high, I would say.
Teddy, I was wondering, as you've been experiencing the last 4 days, you and George, when Lazard started this geopolitical effort, it certainly seemed, it was creative, it was thoughtful, it was needed. These issues are in the boardroom, but did you imagine that you would be as busy as you are today with all of this?
Not at all. I honestly could not have foreseen this, especially because last weekend, we had the whole SCOTUS ruling and all the tariff fallout. And then here we go with, Iran strikes. Although we, as a team, we were prepared for this. I mean, as Bill noted, we've got an amazing group of senior advisors, and we've been following developments closely. Our take was that, we thought that it was highly likely there would be a strike. We were telling clients that, and we were warning them, that all the military assets were in place and they should be prepared. So, it wasn't unforeseen in the short term, but certainly, what was it, 4 years ago when I joined Lazard to start up this unit, it was right before the Russia-Ukraine war, and I thought, that was a fire drill, and it's essentially been fire drills ever since.
George, how do you guys, maybe just while we're talking about this, because you guys put out a memo to Teddy's point, you guys were ready, you put out some thoughts immediately on the situation. How do you take all this information and then weave it into your corporate practice? Like how does it function?
So there's a lot of internal dialogue. I mean, Lazard's structured in a way where information flows very efficiently between the experts on Teddy's team, Teddy and his team. And
how big is the team, Teddy?
So we have about 6 senior advisors that we pull on, folks like Bill, who Admiral McRaven, who
nobody's comfortable saying Bill.
I know. It's very hard. He insists on it though. But but that I have the privilege of working with 6 senior advisors who are amazing. I mean, I mentioned General Eric Kurilla, Jamie Missick, who was deputy director of the CIA before that, the CEO of Kissinger Associates. For tech clients, we work a lot with Chris Miller, who wrote Chip War, may have been on this podcast at some point. I didn't do that research before doing this. Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who's the UK National Security Advisor, and Patrick McHenry, who was a Republican chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, to kind of, on the domestic policy front. And then we've got a dedicated full-time team of between a dozen and 15 individuals focused on different parts of the world.
So you're getting from this team, in addition to the judgment from Bill and General Kurilla and Jamie, you're getting real analysis from the team. And the analysis is not just non-US subject matter. It's, Teddy is an expert on this tariff topic, as is our CEO, Peter Orszag. And what you can have dialogue with clients. So our view is, we got to have strategic relationships with our clients. We have to be thought partners with our clients. Part of that is an awareness of the geopolitical world. And we have the content inside the firm. And so we will be integrating that, quite tightly in our dialogue with clients. For example, risk assessment around particular jurisdictions, or the potential impact financially of tariff outcomes, and the sensitivity in our discounted cash flow analysis. And sometimes it's just background. It's atmospherics. We're thinking about how the geopolitical world could affect volatility and cost of capital, access to capital, and things like that.
And George, anything you tell us about? I was thinking, Bill, it's been very interesting to see how our allies have been reacting, right? And the German Chancellor is at the White House today, but there's been, various signals coming out of allies, some better than others. You guys see boardrooms and executives all over the planet. Are you noticing particular takes on this by region, or people concerned about? It's obviously a super concerning situation, but just anything you'd tell us from your exec point reporting in.
I would say just in the change in the way the United States is relating to its allies and others has created a sense of a need to think about, if you're a non-US company, how those changes require a resetting of any number of business activities. So is the United States a reliable partner on LNG? How do I think about, the risks of events that might be prompted by the United States vis-a-vis what I might be doing? How does all of this affect supply chain? And I think those are the topics that, we see with energy clients and folks who are adjacent to the energy area, or we do agribusiness out of our group in the agribusiness area. We see that sort of effect, and also non-US companies, businesses, governments focusing on how to have the best connectivity with this government in a way that's very different than past administrations.
I had a friend telling me the other day that and we've noticed this, like European boardrooms, they just feel different. They think about different issues. They're designed different, but that as an American in a European boardroom, it felt a lot different. Like, do you just notice is it harder to get a board to see things in the same way in this environment, or just what would those boards, the global boards right now, have to be fascinating places?
So it's when we're dealing with non-US companies, right now it's hard there's been so much that has been fundamental and basic in the way these non-US companies have been thinking about the relationship to the United States, and the reliability of being able to invest capital here, and the certainty of regulation, the certainty of the law, and things like that. And it's just different. And so it just takes a while to socialize that and make a change in strategy and a change in the way capital is being allocated. And then some entities are making the decision that they're just not going to invest in this particular way anymore. They're going to think about things differently, or there's a lot of effort being, for some, in trying to figure out a way, again, to connect with the way that the country's changed in a way that's thoughtful for their business objectives and that aligns with the interests of this administration.
Do you think that maybe all of you, do you think that as companies look at this or organizations look at this and for instance, we've been experiencing Middle Eastern players showing up in the U.S. saying they want to invest in the U.S. for various reasons. Same with Asia. Does this volatility you're talking about, George, around what the U.S. is or is not going to do, does that make you want to invest and have more friends here? Or does it make you say, no, I want to pull away and not be connected to that because it's volatile?
Yeah, so Teddy, why don't you add to this, or Bill? But I think it is doing both. And you see capital allocation decisions that would have been made in a particular way to invest here not being made. And then in some cases, partly to be viewed in a favorable light by this administration, which is a strong-willed administration, you see capital allocations decisions being accelerated to develop more connectivity. But Teddy, what do you think?
No, I completely agree. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's not like, investments transactions in the U.S. slowed down last year. I mean, it accelerated, right? And so I think it's a way, there's a recognition that maybe the kind of considerations in how you approach the U.S. government have changed. The priorities have changed. We've experienced that with clients. I mean, you've seen changes in the level of scrutiny of certain types of clients, right? And I think you mentioned Middle Eastern investors. During the Biden administration, we saw an uptick in CFIUS scrutiny there, a little bit less so this time around. And so it's just a consciousness that you need a strategy around regulatory approval in which you understand what the administration is trying to accomplish and you align yourself and the investment and the way you position it in that light.
So I'll give you one more example. One way to think about this. Think about the typical board meeting of any publicly traded company, serious organization. They very frequently will look the same, and you'll have an agenda. What is our strategy? And there's a chapter now in the strategic sessions of a lot of these non-US entities, which is, how do I invest differently now? How do I think about my business differently now because of the change in the United States? So we can see this with, I have a series of non-US clients where they're specifically making decisions now, large decisions that are different now because of the changed environment. But as Teddy's pointed out, I mean, capital's still flowing here. This is, a wonderful place to do business. And that's the offset to some of the change.
I was wondering, there's Admiral McRaven, the way the map has changed, so to speak, in the last 6, 9, 12 months is pretty striking. I won't do it justice, but in no particular order, Syria went from enemy to friend. Iran went from weak to weaker, but we've got all these problems with them now. Venezuela has changed, at least the government. Cuba is blockaded. And so we started a year ago, the two big battles were Gaza and Ukraine. And now we've moved some of these other pieces. What do you think this means for the Russians and the Chinese in particular? Like, how do they look at this new map, so to speak, and what are they thinking right now?
Yeah, they're probably thinking that there's no way to predict what Trump is going to do next. And that really is the problem. Nobody had Venezuela on their bingo card. This was not something we were thinking about doing. So you have this concern, and you've seen it in the press. How long will the president stay focused on the war in Iran? And this question came up yesterday in the press. And he said, look, I won't get bored. I'm not going to. But Venezuela, we did that. Now we've moved on. Ukraine is still the biggest, fight and conflict since World War II on the European continent. You don't hear much about Ukraine today. Now, granted, we're in a very tough fight in Iran. I understand that. But there's, as administration, you have to be able to walk and chew gum. You need to be able to make sure that you are continuing to deter China in the first chain, in the second chain, that you've got all the resources there. You want to make sure that you're supporting the Ukrainians in a way that's going to allow them to at least hold off the Russians for a long time. You've got to make sure that, we are doing right by rebuilding Gaza and keeping Hamas down. All of these sorts of things. But a lot of times that requires a process whereby, the president and the national security team understands how to delegate authority down to the combatant commanders and to the ambassadors in a way that allows them to kind of run their regional problems as best they can. But when you keep moving from kind of conflict to conflict to conflict to conflict, it is hard for any administration, any military to continue to kind of carry this out. If you think about the pressure that these young kids, these sailors in particular, that have been deployed kind of constantly for the last 10 months or a year in some cases, let me tell you, having spent 10 months on a ship without ever touching port, once, it becomes very challenging. And it wears on them, and it wears on their morale, and it wears on their efficiency. And so after a while, all of this begins to eat away at the capability. And then to your point about Russia and China, how are they viewing this? Well, I think, one, they're viewing it still that the American military is by far and away the most powerful, the most competent military in the world, bar none, no questions asked. I mean, I think the Maduro raid and what we're doing in Iran, the Chinese are waking up and going, oh my gosh, all of our systems didn't work in Venezuela. They don't seem to be working real well in Iran. The American military is more formidable than we thought. That is the good news. I think the bad news is the American military, may be getting a little tired in terms of how much time they've spent deployed. And of course, we are expending a lot of resources in Iran. So let's just hope that we can continue to deter China to give us time to kind of rebuild and kind of refocus on all parts of the map. Because you're right, there's a lot going on in the world. We have historically been able to manage this. And I think we will continue to be able to manage it. Don't misunderstand me, but it's becoming more challenging.
And maybe perhaps this is a optimistic question in its tone, but if you are Russia and China, those pieces we went through, those were your friends.
Yeah.
And so so do you think this is, I guess, another way of saying, is this a slow movement to weaken China and Russia? I mean, you're handling problems as you see them, but is that overly optimistic?
Well, I mean, certainly if you take a look at Iran and what the U.S. and Israel have done here over the last couple of years, last year in particular, it's been pretty significant. I mean, the Israelis hammered Hamas, they've hammered Hezbollah. We've kind of kept the Houthis at bay. This, and as you pointed out earlier, Syria fell. So all this really put Iran on its heels. So, if you were going to strike Iran, again, this is probably the right time to do it because they are kind of back on their heels. The question is, of course, I'm sure the Iranians were hoping that the Chinese or the Russians would provide them some more arms and ammunition, maybe have their back a little bit. I think they're finding out that the Chinese and the Russians aren't the kind of allies that they were hoping for. But part of this is, I don't think Xi wants to get involved in Iran. He doesn't want to provide them hypersonic weapons, nor do the Russians, because the first hypersonic weapon that engages a U.S. ship and creates a mass casualty, that puts the Chinese and the Russians in real peril. And again, as horrific as this fight is in Iran, it reinforces to everybody in the world that the United States military is the finest military in the world, and the second place people are a long way behind.
You mentioned that Venezuelan operation. Were you, I think, to non-military people, it was like incredible. Like you couldn't have even come up with that level of professionalism and creativity.
Right. It was incredible.
Did that surprise even you? Did that surprise you?
Oh, no, it didn't surprise me. I mean, this is what we're really, really good at doing. But even those of us that used to be in the military were incredibly impressed. I mean, this was a very, very complicated mission that was carried off with the highest degree of professionalism. And of course, the president just awarded a Medal of Honor to Eric Slover, the lead helicopter pilot here at the State of the Union, who was kind of shot coming in, but managed to land his helicopter and get the troops off. An incredibly courageous and heroic act. And definitely kind of above and beyond the call. But this was a very, very complicated mission. and done with incredible precision. And so once again, I think the Chinese looked at this and said, my goodness, we had no idea they were that good. And now they're seeing our work in Iran, and I think they're seeing the same sort of thing.
Yeah, Bill, in our lead-in, we talked about basically Trump looking to provide insurance in the Gulf and basically military support of vessels moving through there. I just want to get your sense for, just your naval background. How easy is that to do, to basically patrol the Gulf and basically make sure these ships, is that a foolproof? Is it just, there's a 10% chance something goes wrong? How difficult is that?
Well, I've been through the Straits of Hormuz about half a dozen times. And so what I can tell you is that if you go back to the tanker wars of the 80s, people are kind of looking at it as the model, but that's a bad model to use. Now, it's good from the standpoint of the Iranians mined the strait, and so we had the Samuel B. Roberts was hit. We had a number of other ships were hit. We could not get commercial captains to crew these ships, right? This had nothing to do with insurance. This had to do with, hey, I don't care how much insurance you're insuring the shipping company for, you're not insuring my life. And if you think I'm going to drive that tanker through the Straits of Hormuz and have a surface missile blow my bridge up, you're mistaken. I'm not going to do that at any cost. So we actually had to get American captains, a lot of them from the Military Sealift Command, to come in and crew these ships. Having the escorts worked back in the 80s. It worked because there was no real threat from Iran. We didn't think there were going to be, again, surface missiles coming. Today, the Iranians still have, now that they have the drones, the idea that we're going to put a destroyer or a cruiser alongside a big tanker and drive them through the straits with the threat coming from, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, some of those areas. It's a whole different ballgame now. And if they do mine the straits, which again, most people think that when we talk about mining the straits, there's going to be some big, mining ship that's dropping mines over the side. These will be, if they go back to the Iran Ajar, it was a fishing vessel that had mines on it. They do it very kind of clandestinely. And of course, you've got surface mines and subsurface mines and bottom mines. And that would take a very long time, 3-4 weeks, maybe longer, to clear that just a single lane. So nothing about this would be easy if the Iranians decide they're going to mine it. And I think that's still a question.
I noticed this morning one of the Chinese ministers was commenting. I think his comments were something like, hey, let's keep that strait open. Hey, Iran, stop hitting your neighbors.
Right.
But also we support the sovereignty of Iran and we support Iran. So it was kind of this please do what's best for China, but we're wrapping it in we support Iran. Did the Chinese seem measured? I just throw it out to all you guys. Did they seem measured in this? Because they could be much more.
Well, sure.
They obviously have a lot exposed.
Well, they have a lot of exposed. It's exactly right. They want to keep the strait open because they're getting a very large percentage of their LNG out of there. So they have every interest to keep it open, but they also want this thing to wind down quickly. So I think they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. Teddy?
I mean, I would just, it's important to note, I mean, Iran is their friend, but when you look at overall economic relationships, the Gulf states are as or more important than Iran, right? So in this conflict, China has a very important stake on both sides of the equation, right? Saudi Arabia is a larger source of energy for China than Iran is, even though it buys, 90% of Iranian exports. And the FDI relationship with Saudi, with UAE is much more important and is focused on the critical areas that are essential for Xi Jinping's own, economic priorities, much more so than Iran. So I think that they do genuinely have, whether it's the, continuation of traffic through the straits or just overall stability in the region, they have a interest in, this thing winding down. And that's what you're seeing in the commentary.
Yep.
Do you think, Admiral, the Russians, you go back to the chessboard, but this is a major thing, you would think. The Iranians supply them drones. Like what are the Russians, what could they be doing that they're not? Like, it's just kind of surprising that they're not being more difficult.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure what else they can do but continue to supply the Iranians with, with money, with command and control systems, something that they think will help. Again, most of the drones, to your point, the Russia gets its drones from Iran, not vice versa. So I don't know, off the top of my head, what the Russians could do that, I mean, they could create more, havoc around the world. But I think they're too entrenched in the fight in Ukraine right now. I mean, you think about the number of people that have been lost or killed or injured in the last 4+ years, close to 2 million in terms of both Ukrainians and the Russians, killed and wounded. I mean, that's a figure that's hard to get your head wrapped around. So I think the Russians have enough problems on their own. But Teddy would have some insights on that.
No, I mean, I completely agree with that. But then also, if you're sitting in Moscow, oil prices over $80 a barrel isn't the worst thing in the world, especially because, over the last year, economic growth started to slow down. The projection this year is around 1% growth. And remember, the last 2024 and 2023, they were growing surprisingly fast because of all the military spending at around kind of 3 or 4%. So you don't hate the higher oil prices, and the reports that are trickling out that India is considering, buying more Russian oil if the straits continue to be, effectively blocked. So yes, Iran is an ally. I mean, they signed a strategic partnership with them back in April. But, this current crisis with the U.S. increasingly involved, and it's helpful in terms of energy sales, it's not terrible for them.
I was wondering, Bill, if we talked about the world has been incredibly impressed with the American military, like even more capable than maybe people realized. Have you been surprised that the Russian military seems to have performed as poorly as it has? If that's a fair question.
No, it's a fair question. Yeah, I mean, our former senior advisor and good friend, General John Abizaid, who spent a lot of time in Russia, and Teddy spent time in Russia, but John is the commander of CENTCOM and spent a lot of time over in Europe. He would always tell us that the Russians are a learning organization. So yeah, at the beginning of the invasion, I think we were surprised that they were not near as effective as we thought. A lot of this had to do with the fact that they had Chinese command and control systems that didn't function well. They underestimated the Ukrainians' ability to fight. They were still very kind of Byzantine in their command structure. Once again, the captain had to ask the major, who had to ask the colonel, who had to ask the general, who had to ask Putin, that sort of thing. And that does not allow, kind of flexibility on the battlefield. A lot of their systems, we thought, that they had improved their systems from the T-72, the T-80, T-90 tank, but they hadn't improved their soldiers. And but over the course of the last 4+ years, they have learned and they've become more competent. The problem is, so have the Ukrainians, and so now you're really at this kind of tactical, maybe strategic impasse that nobody seems to be making a lot of progress on the battlefield. They're just killing more people every day. But when you look at the Donbass and you look at the kind of the forward edge of the battle area, it moves a little bit one direction, then kind of moves back, moves a little bit one direction, and then moves back. There really hasn't been any really strategic movement in the last couple of years.
Switching gears on you again, but also in just while we're talking militaries, this operation we have going, with the Israelis, where two militaries are synced in from the beginning. Does that surprise you at the level of cooperation and competence that seems to exist between the two militaries?
No. We've been working with the Israelis for a very, very long time. We understand their procedures. They understand our procedures. This is, I'm sure the way they have worked this is, you have what we call an ATO, an air traffic order. Everybody, you divvy up the target list. You deconflict the air people out of our air. And again, I'll leave some of the locations out of this, but we have the ability to see what's going on in the air, to track the Israelis. They can track us. We kind of coordinate. So no, none of this surprises me.
George, I was wondering, as we were talking about all this, we talked about attitudes in non-U.S. boardrooms and companies managing around U.S. changes and risks, so to speak. What about U.S. boardrooms and how all this is factoring in for them? Are they looking at good investments around the world? Is it up? Is it down? What do you notice from that?
Well, I just tell you, based on our practice, I do a lot of board meetings with Bill and Teddy, and and boards are really interested in the impacts on their strategy and capital allocation choices based on what's happening from a geopolitical perspective. And the same is true with domestic politics. How do I, and the domestic environment and budgetary issues and things like that. So I think much more time being spent on how this is impacting, how this should impact business decisions. Where am I going to invest inorganically? Do I even want to invest inorganically? And then the intents for companies exposed to the tariffs, which is everyone effectively, directly or indirectly. How does that change in the economics of the relevant business affect value, cost of capital? How do I adjust my views on supply chain? How do I exit China? Supply chain topics. I mean, it's sort of running through board discussions.
I'm curious if the three of you see companies, because I think, Mike, we've felt this a little bit, is that energy policy, power prices, power availability, certainly regulatory stuff to get things done, it was pulling businesses out of Europe, Canada, maybe Australia, and they were coming to the US, a lot of them to Texas.
Right.
Is that is that what you have felt? Like, how big is energy, power prices, all of that in the boardroom these days?
It depends on the company. I mean, there might be, and for some companies it's more distant and maybe it's a topic of discussion, but it might not be particularly relevant. But in energy, our business is built on this thesis that you need to look at the broad energy spectrum and be talking to people in the energy spectrum about things that are in other parts of the energy spectrum. And everyone's focused on power. Everyone's focused on power demand. Where's it going to come from? Is it nuclear? Where are you going to get the gas turbines? Can you get permitted? Where's the workforce going to come from to build the gas-fired power plant? So it's just cutting across the whole sector. So if I'm a natural gas C&P company, how do I think about this? I'm producing a lot of gas. Maybe I'm in the Permian. I can't get it out. So how do I make that a more valuable part of my asset base? Or if you're a pipeline company, how do I build pipeline spurs to the power plants that need to be built? It's a topic that cuts across the whole energy spectrum.
I was thinking, you guys, the legacy of Lazard, you've done so much in Europe in your history, and this when the Qataris shut in and all those cargoes are no longer going to Europe, it's kind of a reminder Europe has a real supply problem and vulnerability with energy. Is there anything, Teddy, you'd add to that discussion? It dates obviously back to the Ukraine and Russian gas, but it's what would you tell us about Europe and energy vulnerability?
I mean, look, they're clearly vulnerable, right? Just in terms of some of the decisions and part of it is their own decision making dating back to the dependence on Russian gas in the first place, right? Which, in retrospect, seems to have been a big error. And look, we are a far way from the peak of where energy prices were. Natural gas prices were in the height of the wake of the Ukraine crisis, right? So even though we had the kind of 50% spike after Qatar Energy announced the shutdown, we've still come a long way down, and Europe has diversified a bit, but they are fundamentally vulnerable, and we hear that from companies too, that just structurally higher energy costs make it more difficult when it comes to things like reshoring production, and you still have the legacy of kind of industrial scarring from the whole Ukraine war episode. And to your point around the U.S. being a more attractive market in that respect, we hear that too.
I think you're going to see much more done strategically around the power stack in Europe, and much more focus on where is the reliable and low-cost supplier of LNG for the long term. U.S. still looks pretty good to us. There's a lot of LNG that can still be constructed here, and the Europeans need to be comfortable that this is going to be a reliable source of supply. I think you'll see a lot of rearview mirror looking at, and there has been around the decisions to shut down nuclear plants, the need for 24/7 power, which cannot come, you can't, I've said this before in other episodes, there's no such thing as 24/7 renewables. So you're going to need natural gas fired generation, and new nuclear in some of the jurisdictions to push growth there.
One thread we were on there for a minute, Bill, that I didn't grab, but I meant to, which is you got to you alluding to the U.S.'s ability to keep doing this,
Right.
and our supplies, and you do hear these stories about we use quite a lot of missiles, if you will, to shoot down a drone. Like what would you tell us about the U.S.'s ability to do this for an extended period? Like, is that risk factor overblown, or is that real? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real risk factor. I mean, it always is in any conflict. And what you have to do as a targeteer, so if you're thinking about, okay, this is going to go for the next 4 or 5 weeks, then you're going to take a look at your stockpiles. And of course, it's not just the stockpiles we have in theater. What will happen is they will draw supplies, stocks, for the Patriots and the THAADs and the T-LAMs. They'll bring them from the Pacific if they need to. So you kind of rob Peter to pay Paul sort of thing for a short period of time. But also someone will say, well, look, we can use a Tomahawk land attack missile, or we can drop a 1,000-pound bomb. Now, the 1,000-pound bomb means you got to put an F-15 or an F-18 in a position of greater threat. But we will have air superiority, meaning there's probably not going to be anything the Iranians can do. Within a week, we'll have kind of air superiority over there. So our ability to drop 2,000-pound and 1,000-pound bombs will be, pretty easy to do, which means now we don't have to fire as many T-LAMs from the ships and the submarines. So this is all how the military manages the fight. So I think we'll be fine for the next 4 or 5 weeks if it goes that long. And we will have to draw on certain munitions from other parts of the globe, but that is something that the logisticians do all the time.
Yeah, this is probably a question for you, Teddy. I look at, when I had talked about the lead-in about Qatari gas being down for the first time in 30 plus years. I was like, okay, that gas is never going to go off. It's always available. It's there, right? Mm-hmm. And you're looking at other Arab countries are looking to grow their gas, export capabilities as well. When you think about what just happened here, do companies start to say, okay, do we really have to step back and look at these contracts, know who we're basically getting this stuff from? How does this change basically the dynamics of contracts in the next couple of years? Are people going to say, you know what, U.S. may be a little bit more expensive, but you know what, we can count on that supply? Maybe it's a bit early, but how do you think that's going to change?
I think obviously, trusted suppliers outside of the region, right, are going to get preference, and the U.S. is chief among them. So, if you think about the kind of both the short-term and the longer-term economic winners at least on a relative basis out of this crisis, you'd have to say the United States is a net exporter, is much better positioned than Europe, than China, even though China's stockpiled, obviously, as you guys I'm sure have been followed, for months. For a Taiwan conflict, to be clear, not a Middle Eastern conflict, but they're going to be able to draw down from this. They're going to be able to switch probably more easily than a South Korea or a Taiwan from LNG to coal, which I think is in part why you saw that spike in coal prices that you mentioned at the outset of the call. So they'll be okay, but they'll still take an economic hit, right? But the U.S., on a relative basis, will be better off, right, than those other partners. So I think both in the overall, kind of macro context, but then also on just as companies, countries look at, okay, secure supply moving forward. If you're Europe, you're concerned about, as George mentioned, after the whole Greenland episode, you're probably concerned around dependencies on the United States, including on LNG, right? And we've heard that. But then you see this episode and you say, okay, well, what else is on offer, right? In terms of LNG, is it, should we be dependent upon the Strait of Hormuz and, Qatar and this not flaring up again? Or would we rather go with, a bet on the transatlantic reliance? So I think net U.S. benefits.
Mike, just one thing to add to Teddy. If you look at the global need for LNG and where our resource base is, and the security of taking gas from the United States, plus our need for power here, which is all going to be dominated by gas through the 2030s in our view. There's just, the gas resource here is just highly attractive, and I think you'll see a lot of resource developed, pipeline infrastructure developed to get this to market.
Well, that was the other point I wanted to make, is that, I mean, everyone always thinks about oil flows, how that moves, right? But now you got to really start thinking about over the next 20, 30 years, how natural gas is going to be moving, where that's going. And that's a whole nother ballgame altogether.
Do you guys, when you talk about U.S. risk, I think, the mind quickly goes to, we have an unpredictable president. But is the source of that anxiety really just we are swinging between administrations which have very different policies, and we just keep doing it? And so U.S. risk, when people talk about U.S. risk, is that really it's the Governor Newsom will change everything risk, if you will? Is that the way to think about this U.S. risk that you're talking about? It's the volatility of the administration.
It's more the back and forth of the volatility. So there are a lot of offshore wind companies that put a lot of money, here into our system that have been stopped, and that isn't that when they made the investment choice to do this, they were not predicting this. So I think it's the back and forth, and not really making decisions in the middle of the aisle on things like permitting reform, where there should be alignment between the parties, or the country needs a ton of power. So we should be, the public policy system here should be encouraging the development of new power assets in a way that is in some ways outcome agnostic as to resource.
Yeah. Can I add one element to that, which is, in addition to the kind of pendulum swinging back and forth, you also have this trend in terms of, regulatory rulemaking becoming more discretionary, right? And I would say you're seeing that on display in the Trump administration with the kind of erosion of some of the independent agencies. But even, during the Biden administration with the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel blockage, right, under CFIUS, or the kind of the expansive view on antitrust to achieve, other policy ends beyond traditional market concentration. You're starting to see the U.S. government take into account, kind of policy and political whims rather than kind of a traditional rules-based approach in terms of regulatory decision making. And so when you couple that with the volatility, that makes that swing that much more impactful for businesses, right? Because if you get a Democratic president in power in post 2028, some of the decisions that the Trump administration is making on striking deals with companies and or conditioning certain regulatory approvals, some of that may be applied for Democratic ends as well, right? So that's an overall trend that we're seeing too.
Well, we've got to wrap up. This is it's terrible to lose you guys, but you've been most generous with your time. Bill, could we wrap up with you? And you've been there, you've done it. You're one of the nation's great warriors, and on behalf of all of us, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure joining.
How do we? Is your base case that in a few weeks we're out of this and we've won?
Yeah, I wouldn't predict anything right now. I mean, I don't, I think every day we see a change in terms of the battlefield, if you will, as this fight begins to spread, as the Iranians seem to be kind of persisting through the initial onslaught. I'd be a little reluctant to say, look, this is going to be over in a week or 2 weeks or 5 weeks. I just don't know, to be honest with you.
Well, it makes sense. None of us should make those predictions, but we feel better talking to the three of you. So thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.